My topic is a Messianic Jewish perspective on Luke and Acts, and this book, Jerusalem Crucified, is largely based on exegesis of Luke and Acts. So what I'm going to be presenting here is a kind of précis, a kind of summary of some of the main points of this book. There's a few copies back there for those of you who would like to purchase it at about 50% of its regular cost. I'm dealing with Luke and Acts here in a somewhat different way than we've been dealing with the Gospels so far, or Acts. When presenters have been speaking about Luke or the other Gospels, we've been largely treating them as windows into the reality of the events taking place in the life of Yeshua. When we've been citing from Acts, we've been largely using it as background to try to understand what was going on with Paul. But that's not what I'm doing here. So you have to get yourself into a different frame of mind. What I'm doing is looking at the perspective that is demonstrated by the author or the final editor of these two books. That's my topic. So I'm looking at something that has to do with Jewish life, perhaps in the year, as I would see it, maybe the year 80 or 90. Some people would even put it a little bit later, but clearly after the destruction of Jerusalem, not before the destruction of Jerusalem. So, in my book, Jerusalem Crucified, Jerusalem Risen, I offer a Messianic Jewish reading of Luke and Acts, which highlights the Lucan eschatological message and its concern for the city of Jerusalem and the Jewish people. In what follows, I will summarize that reading, contrast it with the traditional Christian construal of Luke and Acts, but I will also begin with some hermeneutical reflections on the importance of the Messianic Jewish perspective on Scripture and theology in general. Scholars of the past half-century have underlined social location as a critical component in the interpretation of biblical texts. Issues of social location become especially crucial when assessing what a New Testament text says about the Jewish people and the Jewish way of life. In the case of Luke and Acts, Marilyn Salmon articulates simply the basic question: is the writer of Luke Acts an insider or an outsider? Does he stand outside Judaism, or is he mishpacha? If the writer is an insider, then any criticism he offers of the Jewish people is self-criticism rather than criticism of another group. In contemporary terms, one need only think of how racial or ethnic epithets are interpreted differently depending on the identity of the speaker and the social context in which they are uttered. Of even more relevance to our discussion, hermeneutical concerns call for us to reflect on the social location not only of the original authors and readers, but also they call us to consider the social location of us, of later readers. These writings, composed in a period when Christian identity was not yet a thing, and when Jewish identity was somewhat fluid, were later read by people who presupposed solidified Christian and Jewish identities, which were mutually exclusive. The ecclesial exegetical tradition as a whole developed within a social framework which could no longer conceive of these writings as internal Jewish texts. In this light, the emergence of the Messianic Jewish movement has profound hermeneutical implications. For the first time since the creation of the New Testament, as a canon, a community exists which treats that canon as authoritative and also identifies itself with the Jewish people and its history. Messianic Jews require no imaginative leap to read these texts as Jewish writings. Instead, we need to make such a leap when we're asked to consider that they might contain non-Jewish or anti-Jewish elements. Our social location is thus a hermeneutical asset, which alerts us to textual cues which might have seemed inconsequential to traditional Christian exegetes or to historical scholars who have taken the Jew-Christian dichotomy as a given. At the same time, we must acknowledge that our social location liberates our exegetical imagination through imposing interpretive constraints. We are constrained by three assumptions, the third of which is the logical conclusion of the first two. First, the divine election of Israel is irrevocable, and we Jewish disciples of Yeshua are an essential part of that Israel. Two, the New Testament with Tanakh is authoritative scripture which shapes our lives. And three, the New Testament as a whole teaches, assumes, or at least does not deny the irrevocable election of Israel. While our study of Scripture has played a role in forming these assumptions, they now function in our social context as incontrovertible axioms, which open up certain exegetical options and close off others. We should frankly acknowledge these interpretive constraints and not pretend that we come to the text free of presuppositions. Nevertheless, our consequent interpretations of the text must make exegetical sense apart from these presuppositions. If we are seeing something that is actually there, others should also be able to see it once we have pointed it out. Our social location is a hermeneutical asset because it is closer to that of the original authors and readers. Corresponding to this, the social location of past Christian readers was a hermeneutical liability. To the problematic character of the traditional Christian reading of Luke and Acts, we now turn. The traditional Christian reading of Luke, Acts. As noted above, the Christian tradition of Luke-Acts exegesis emerged in a social context in which Christian and Jewish identity were mutually exclusive. The church was now predominantly a community of those from Gentile background, joined by a small number of former Jews. Its members viewed her as the new Israel, successor to the old Israel, which had been corporately disinherited. Readers of Luke and Acts in these circumstances viewed Zechariah, Elizabeth, Mary, Joseph, Peter, James, and Paul, not to mention Yeshua himself, as fellow Christians who had left behind their Jewish identity. Of course, such readers could not help but notice the reiteration of Israel's national hopes in the Lucan infancy narrative, or the emphasis in Luke and Acts on the Torah observance of Joseph, Mary, and the apostles. But these national hopes were interpreted in universal and spiritual terms. The temple was Jesus. Jerusalem was the church. The land of Israel was the entire world. The Torah observance of Jesus' family and followers was a way of honoring the past while transitioning to a post-Jewish future. Christian interpreters paid much attention to the author's concern for history and his placement of the Yeshua movement in its global context. Unlike the other Gospels, the career of John the Baptist is set by Luke during the reign of Tiberius Caesar and under the various local Roman and Jewish officials of the day. This preoccupation with history and global context is also reflected in the book of Acts, with its confrontations between Paul and named Jewish and Roman authorities, known also from the writings of Josephus. Christian readers saw this as a move away from a Jewish apocalyptic orientation, which anticipated an imminent rupture in the historical fabric. History had entered a new phase with the coming of Jesus and the transfer of the covenant from the Jewish people to the church, but history itself and the global Roman Empire, which was its governmental agent, would continue into the indefinite future. In other words, the gospel proclaimed in Luke and Acts had little to do with eschatology, just as it had little to do with the Jewish people or the land of Israel. This universalizing message was seen as implicit in the geographical structure of Acts. The book begins in Jerusalem, but then moves steadily outwards, concluding in Rome, the heart of the civilized world. The movement of Acts is thus centrifugal rather than centripetal. This expresses, in spatial terms, the meaning of the gospel message, according to this reading. While that message begins with the Jewish people in the land of Israel, God intends to establish the new people of God as a gathering of Gentiles centered in the imperial capital. In the final scene of Acts, the author depicts in dramatic form the transfer of covenantal privilege from genealogical Israel to the Church of the Nations. Here, Paul addresses the leaders of the Jewish community in Rome and pronounces judgment upon them for their failure to believe the message he proclaims. The future belongs not to Israel, but to the church. Thus, Luke works out his universal vision and his negation of the significance of Jerusalem, the land of Israel, and the Jewish people through the subtle shaping of his historical narrative. Something similar is found in the treatment of Torah observance. We first encounter a Jerusalem church of Torah-observant Jews who worship regularly at the temple. God then speaks to Peter in a dream, commanding him to eat animals forbidden in the Torah, thereby revealing that the Jewish dietary laws had been abolished. This revelation is at first resisted by Peter and by the Jewish disciples of Yeshua, but it gains a forceful advocate after Saul the persecutor becomes Paul the apostle. The nullification of the distinctively Jewish components of the ritual law is finally ratified by the decisions of the Jerusalem Council. The path is now clear for Paul, the true hero of the story, to carry the universal gospel from the doomed Jewish capital to its new imperial center in Rome. A striking feature of this traditional Christian reading of Luke Acts is the way in which it minimizes the distinctive theological contribution of Luke and Acts within the biblical canon. The Gospel of Luke loses its particular voice by being subordinated to John and Matthew and by being separated from Acts. Acts itself becomes a mere historical source book, which tells of the transition from a Jewish to a non-Jewish church and provides biographical background to the Pauline letters. In theological terms, Luke and Acts offer nothing new to help in sorting out Paul's complex writings or in interpreting the significance of Jesus' life, teaching, death, resurrection, or ascension. This is how Luke and Acts looked from the vantage point of a Christian church separated from the Jewish people and hostile to it. Now let us consider how the same text might appear from a Messianic Jewish perspective. A Messianic Jewish reading of Luke and Acts. My principal exegetical and theological findings in Jerusalem Crucified can be summarized under three headings. 1, Jerusalem and eschatology. 2, Jewish disciples of Yeshua and Torah. 3, divine judgment and the rise of Rabbinic Judaism. So, first of all, Jerusalem and eschatology. In contrast to standard readings of Luke and Acts, which treat eschatology as an insignificant concern of the author, I see these books as offering a response to the recent destruction of Jerusalem, a response founded on a prophetic hope for a future restoration. While the author works within the historical genre, his theological vision merits comparison not only with Josephus, but also with Jewish apocalyptic texts composed in the same period, such as 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch. Like all of those contemporaneous Jewish texts, Luke and Acts see the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple as a theological problem to be confronted in grief and hope, rather than a victory to be celebrated. That hope is centered on the return of Yeshua, which will be precipitated by Israel's national repentance and which will accomplish Israel's national restoration. The Lucan view of history is oriented to its ultimate fulfillment on that day when the Messiah's feet again stand on the Mount of Olives. I give special attention to the geographical structure of Luke and Acts. All commentators note the central role of Jerusalem in the Gospel of Luke, which begins in the city, ends in the city, and depicts the intervening drama as transpiring largely during Yeshua's extended journey to the city in the heart of the Gospel of Luke. Acts likewise begins in Jerusalem, but from that point on, the direction of movement is steadily outwards, ending in Rome, the capital city of the empire. As already noted, commentators have traditionally understood this geographical structure as conveying a supersessionist message. Jerusalem represents the past, but Rome stands for the present and future. But this reading of the geographical structure of Acts leaves out a crucial feature. Every time the story takes another step outward, it concludes that stage of the story by returning to Jerusalem. Paul encounters Jesus on the road to Damascus and then returns to Jerusalem. Peter proclaims Yeshua to Cornelius in Caesarea and then returns to Jerusalem. A congregation arises in Antioch and then sends aid to Jerusalem in a time of famine. Paul and Barnabas journey from Antioch to Asia Minor and then return afterward to Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Council. From Jerusalem, Paul travels with Silas to Greece and then returns again to Jerusalem. Paul takes his final journey as a free man and then returns to Jerusalem where he is arrested. For one who reads carefully and senses the dynamic ebb and flow of the narrative, with the ebb continuously expanding outwards, but always flowing back to its center, the end of the book comes as a shock. The tide has been halted in the middle of its movement. What is the message here? Since Luke and Acts are both likely written after 70, The original readers knew that Jerusalem would be destroyed by Rome not long after Paul's entry to the Gentile capital. As a result, Israel and the Yeshua community, which is inextricably tied to Israel, are in exile. And Rome, the New Babylon, symbolizes that exile. So Rome in Acts is not symbolizing the great new center of the church, the capital. It's the place of exile, just as Babylon was for the Jewish people after the destruction of the first temple. Therefore, the point of this geographical structure is to convey prophetic hope for Israel. The story is not over. That's the message of the end of Acts. The story is not over, but will only reach its conclusion when the tide flows back to its source, the place where it began. This geographical eschatological message of Acts receives an interpretation through the core narrative of the Gospel of Luke, which depicts Yeshua's lengthy journey to Jerusalem. As N.T. Wright has suggested, this journey of Yeshua to Jerusalem should be viewed against the backdrop of the prophetic anticipation of Yud-He-Vav-He's return to Zion. However, Wright has misunderstood the way Luke employs this biblical image. He assumes that Luke views Yeshua's entry to the city as the literal fulfillment of the prophetic hope, which results in the restoration of the true Israel, that is, the church, and the judgment of unfaithful Israel, that is, the Jewish people. But Luke does not view Yeshua's entry into the city as the literal fulfillment of Isaiah 40 or 52 or Ezekiel 43 or Zechariah 14. But instead, he views Yeshua's entry into the city as itself a prophetic sign act, anticipating Yeshua's triumphant return at the end of the age. This is evident through the Lucan linkage of three incidents. One, Yeshua's mourning over Jerusalem while he is still in Galilee in Luke 13. Two, Yeshua's entry to Jerusalem in Luke 19. And three, Yeshua's ascension to heaven in Acts chapter 1. In the first of these texts, Yeshua anticipates his own arrest and execution in Jerusalem and prophesies the resulting judgment of Jerusalem. It's in this context where he says, "See, your house is left to you." That is, God will abandon the city and temple, rendering them vulnerable to the attack of enemy armies. But he concludes his words with a conditional promise of a return of God to Zion after the divine departure in 70, when he says, "You, namely Jerusalem, will not see me until the time comes when you say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." In the second text, Yeshua descends from the Mount of Olives and rides toward Jerusalem. As in the other Gospels, he is acclaimed by the crowds with the words of Psalm 118 referred to in the conditional promise of Luke 13. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. That's the way it's formulated in Luke. But unlike the other Gospels, Luke states that those reciting these words are the whole multitude of the disciples. It's left kind of ambiguous in the other Gospels who's actually saying these words. And Luke makes this explicit. It's the crowd of disciples of Yeshua who are entering the city with him. In other words, it's not the people of Jerusalem coming out of the city to welcome Yeshua with the words, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. That was the content of the Luke 13 passage, where Yeshua is speaking to Jerusalem, saying, "You, Jerusalem, will not see me until you say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. So, the condition stipulated of Luke 13 has not been met. For those words were directed to the people and leaders of the capital. So Yeshua's entry to Jerusalem in Luke 19 is but a prophetic sign pointing to an as yet unrealized hope. One biblical scholar called it the non-triumphal entry, which I think points out particularly what Luke is seeing. This is not the great triumphal entry. It's actually a reflection of the fact that the city is not giving Yeshua the response that he's looking for. Finally, the third text, after Yeshua has ascended to heaven from the Mount of Olives, 2 men in white robes appear to the 11 with a new promise. This Yeshua, who has been taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven. In other words, Yeshua will return to the Mount of Olives, because the text in Acts is very deliberate in telling us that the site of the ascension is the Mount of Olives. And from the Mount of Olives, Yeshua will make the grand entry into the city, which will be the true and final return of Yud-He Vav-He to Zion. Only implicit here in the Acts 1 text, but stated openly in Acts chapter 3, verses 19 through 21, a speech that Peter is giving to the people of Jerusalem, is the fact that this return will necessarily be preceded by the fulfillment of the conditional promise of Luke 13. In that day, the people and leaders of Jerusalem will welcome the king with the words, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. These 3 interlocking texts thus provide a theological interpretation of the Lucan narrative of Yeshua's extended journey to Jerusalem, and that narrative in turn sheds light on the geographical structure of the book of Acts. When Acts ends, the story of Israel remains unfinished. The Jewish people will again return to the land and inhabit the city of Jerusalem. And that initial regathering of the exiles will make possible the national response of welcome offered by the people and leaders of Jerusalem when Yeshua's feet again rest on the Mount of Olives. Finally, I argue in Jerusalem Crucified that Luke links the death of Yeshua to the coming destruction of Jerusalem, but also sees his resurrection as the first fruits of the city's future restoration. Jerusalem's rejection of the prophets sent to her culminates in her rejection of Yeshua, which results in the catastrophe of 70. However, in the 2 Lucan texts cited above, Luke 13 and Luke 19, the entry, and in Luke's depiction of the crucifixion itself in Luke 23, the author superimposes the death of Yeshua and the destruction of Jerusalem in a manner that creates a far more complex picture. In my reading of these texts, Yeshua voluntarily enters into solidarity with his people in the suffering they are destined to undergo. In other words, it's not just the people are punished in 70 because they didn't respond properly to Yeshua. It's also Yeshua looking forward to a judgment which has been coming for a long time. And that doesn't result simply because of the rejection of Yeshua, but comes because of the rejection to prophets that have been sent by God to Jerusalem for generations. And Yeshua is looking on the horizon and seeing that coming, that punishment that's coming. And then in his crucifixion, he is entering into that suffering himself. It's as if 70 is happening right on the cross. In my reading of these texts, Yeshua voluntarily enters into solidarity with his people in the suffering they are destined to undergo. Just as his baptism at the hands of John signified his identification with his own people in their sin and need for repentance, so his cross, symbolized in advance by his baptism, represented his participation in Israel's sufferings. Moreover, his resurrection constituted a divine pledge that Israel's earthly body would never perish, and that Zion would once again be the city of the great king. This means that the gospel message of the death and the resurrection of the Messiah is itself a prophetic message pointing to the future history of the Jewish people in both exile and return. This relates to the discussion we had in the last session about the gospel message and its relationship to the Jewish people. My argument in this book is that the Jewish people are part of the gospel message. Far from being unconcerned with eschatology, Luke and Acts turn out to be thoroughly eschatological in their message. Moreover, their eschatological message is rooted in the death and resurrection of the Messiah and anticipates the fruit his redemptive work will ultimately yield in the life of the Jewish people and the destiny of the city of Jerusalem. Now we move on to Jewish disciples of Yeshua and Torah. The traditional Christian consensus regarding the role of the Torah in Luke and Acts has been unraveling for the last half century. In 1972, Jacob Jervel asserted the following: "For Luke, the law remains the law given to Israel on Sinai, and Luke is concerned about the law because it is Israel's law. It is significant that Luke is most concerned about the ritual and ceremonial aspects of the law. The law is to him not essentially the moral law, but the mark of distinction between Jews and non-Jews. The law is the sign of Israel as the people of God." End of quote. And for Luke, this law remains in force. Again, Jervel. For Luke, it is impossible that the law should be abrogated, replaced, or conceived as an epoch. Why is this so important to Luke? According to Jervel, again I quote, "Luke's view of the law is bound up with his ecclesiology. Jewish Christians, being the restored Israel, are the foundation of the church, and so they must be upholders of the law." Jervel's work gave impetus to a new direction in Lucan scholarship. It is no longer assumed by exegetes that Peter's dream in Acts 10 implies the abolition of the Jewish dietary laws, or the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 undermines the obligatory status of the Torah, even for Gentiles, far less for Jews. Moreover, Jervel's ecclesiological interpretation of the Torah's importance for Luke has reinforced the new attention given by scholars to the corporate life of the early Jewish disciples of Yeshua. Jervel's insights also opened a new window into the ancient author's purposes, particularly regarding the book of Acts. Again, quoting from Jervel, "Paul is Luke's real problem. This is evident from Acts 21 through 28, chapters dedicated to Paul and the law. Luke depicted Paul as the great missionary among Jews who in every synagogue in the diaspora gathered the penitent Israel and taught them to adhere to circumcision and the law. And in the concluding chapters of Acts, Paul is still the pious Pharisee, faithful to the law." End of quote. This perspective on Luke's purpose highlights the significance of Acts 21 as a climactic moment in the narrative as a whole. In Jerusalem Crucified, I build upon the framework erected by Jervel and give special attention to Acts 21. In that chapter, Paul meets with James and the Jerusalem elders, who inform him that the multitude of Jewish disciples of Yeshua in the city, all zealous for the Torah, have heard rumors that Paul teaches all the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses and not circumcise their children or observe the customs. This sounds much like what Christian readers of Paul's letters through the centuries have thought to be Paul's orientation to the Torah. Such a view was likely already in circulation when Acts was written, and given Luke's own understanding of the Torah, made Paul's approach to Jewish Torah praxis Luke's real problem. I argue, in Jerusalem Crucified, that the author of Acts addressed this problem by carefully constructing the Lucan infancy narrative and the story of Paul in a manner that prepared the reader for what would be described in Acts 21. He did so by including in the infancy narrative, almost in passing, reference to 3 Jewish practices ordained by the Torah. He then mentioned these 3 practices, once again almost in passing, as part of Paul's pattern of life. Finally, he brought together all 3 practices in Acts 21, indicating thereby the harmony existing between Paul's own practice, his teaching to other Jewish disciples of Yeshua, and the way of life of the Torah-observant family of Yeshua. In the infancy narrative represented by Zechariah, Elizabeth, Mary, and Joseph, but in the greater narrative of Acts, including that the family is represented by James, who is the one speaking to Paul in Acts 21. The 3 practices at issue are circumcision, a vow, or a Nazarite vow, and the Chagim, the pilgrim festivals. In the infancy narrative, they appear in passing in connection with Yeshua's circumcision, John's call to be a lifelong Nazarite, and the journey of Yeshua's family to Jerusalem for the observance of Pesach. In the Pauline narrative, the 3 practices reappear, again in passing, in brief descriptions of Paul's circumcision of Timothy, his own vow in Acts 18, and his intention to be in Jerusalem to celebrate Shavuot. Finally, in Acts 21, the 3 now coalesce to bear enormous weight. They're no longer just in passing. They are now fundamental to the narrative. As Paul, having made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the celebration of the Chag, seeks by means of a vow to prove that he teaches Jewish disciples of Yeshua to circumcise their children and live according to the Jewish customs. All in accordance with direction given him by a member of the family of Yeshua. The careful preparation for this scene underscores its significance for the author, as does the fact noted by Yerval that the remaining chapters of Acts 21 through 28, focus upon Paul's defense of his enduring loyalty to his people, the temple, and the Torah. Given the ecclesiological significance of the Torah for the author of Luke and Acts, the centrality of Acts 21 demonstrates the author's concern for preserving a distinctive Jewish corporate witness to Israel's resurrected Messiah. Finally, divine judgment and the rise of Rabbinic Judaism. But what about the Jews who do not enter the Jewish Yeshua community? This was a difficult theological issue for our ancient author, but becomes far more complicated in later centuries after the church's violent suppression of Jewish life in her midst. Writing before that tragic turn, but with an apparent intuition of the danger ahead, especially through the misreading of Paul, the Lucan volumes contain intriguing possibilities that have been largely unexplored. For many commentators, the author's negative use of the plural term loudaioi, the Jews, suggests that he considers those Jews who do not believe in Yeshua to be cut off from God and from Israel. The Jewish Yeshua community is not only the first fruits of Israel's restoration, it is now all that remains of Israel. On 3 occasions, Paul encounters opposition from loudaioi and responds by going to the Gentiles. The 3rd such encounter occurs in the final scene of Acts and is taken by many to indicate that God is now finished with the Jews. In Jerusalem Crucified, I propose that the author uses the term loudaioi to refer to ordered Jewish communities whose welcoming corporate response to Yeshua was required for his return and the establishment of his kingdom. In the climactic scene in Rome, the Jewish leaders are divided in their response. Nevertheless, Paul's reaction is just as harsh as when he encountered a solid block of hostility. Why this disproportionate reaction by Paul in Rome? I suggest that the author is not faulting Jewish communities for a rejection of Yeshua, which results in their extirpation from Israel. Instead, he faults them for their failure to welcome Yeshua with the words Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, which paradoxically confirms their covenantal status as those whose embrace of the Messiah remains necessary for the establishment of his rule in the world. Writing in the wake of the destruction of Jerusalem, Luke follows the pattern set by the biblical prophets and discerns in this catastrophic event an act of divine judgment upon Israel. This judgment has come because Israel has failed to respond positively at this decisive moment of its history. Nevertheless, God is not finished with Israel or with Jerusalem. Luke again adheres to the pattern set by the biblical prophets in holding out hope for the future consolation of Israel. Despite its infidelity, Israel remains Israel, and the God of Israel remains Israel's God. Now, I'm not going to be able to finish everything that I have here. Let me just briefly say something that I'll elaborate on a little bit more in the discussion time with AJ. For me, a key figure in Acts is Gamaliel and Gamaliel's speech. I see Gamaliel's speech as being, as pointing to the author, the Lucan author's perspective on the importance of the fact that the Sadducees have perished, those who are seeking to oppose the apostles. The Yeshua movement has survived and thrived post-70. But also the Pharisees, represented by Gamaliel, they've now survived and they've risen to a greater measure of prominence. And part of my argument in Jerusalem Crucified is that Luke has a positive attitude towards the Pharisees, and that this reflects his sense that a kind of purification is coming to the Jewish people through 70, and that the Pharisees rising to authority are actually seen by him as a hopeful sign, replacing the role that the Sadducees place. It's interesting that Luke is actually careful at times to distinguish between Sadducees and Pharisees in Jerusalem in opposition to Yeshua in a way that isn't the case in all of the Gospels. So let me conclude at this point. As I acknowledged at the outset, this Messianic Jewish reading of Luke and Acts began with a particular set of assumptions not held by all interpreters of the New Testament. Nevertheless, the results of my investigation must stand scrutiny from those who do not share the same assumptions. Is my construal of Luke and Acts at least a plausible one, offering a reasonable accounting of the textual data? I think so, but others must judge. For those who find this reading of Luke and Acts not merely plausible but compelling, the theological payoff is plentiful. These Lucan volumes now show themselves to be uniquely powerful New Testament witnesses to the eschatological centrality of the city of Jerusalem and the Jewish people, to the enduring validity of the Torah as Israel's national constitution, to the ecclesiological significance of Jewish disciples of Yeshua, and to the potential value of rabbinic tradition. The Messianic Jewish perspective on Acts in particular suggests that we should take its canonical positioning before the Pauline corpus as a hermeneutical guide, instructing us to read the epistles in the light of the Lucan version of Paul's story. Rather than mere historical background, Acts suddenly becomes a crucial theological source book for understanding the New Testament message as a whole. The rebirth of Jewish community of disciples of Yeshua has profound hermeneutical implications for the interpretation of the New Testament. If the exegetical implications of that distinctive social location become more widely known and accepted, the boundaries of the Jewish and Christian communities might themselves be redrawn, and then none can predict the future shape of our transformed social location or its further hermeneutical yield. The author of Luke and Acts, at least as I understand him, would rejoice to see that day. Thank you.